Well, what better place to start than the so-called climate emergency? Let's have a listen to Mark Butler, Labor's Mark Butler, speaking today.
Mr Speaker, the world is currently on track to exceed 3 degrees of global warming, which would be utterly catastrophic for the planet and for humanity. We are failing our children, we're failing our grandchildren and generations beyond that. This motion is a chance for the Parliament to change course.
Fantastic. OK, Nicholas, I've got to start with you. Come on, it's been so long. So, Nicholas, away you go. Tell us whether you agree with this climate emergency and whether Labor is on the right track politically pushing this climate emergency.
So, look, I do think there is a climate emergency, and I'm pleased to report that as a councillor in the City of Melbourne did declare that we believe the world is facing a climate emergency. And we do that not as a rhetorical flourish to try and focus much-needed public attention on the issue, but as a straight statement of the situation we're in and what the evidence tells us is the challenge that we're facing. I mean, as you mentioned earlier in the program, much of southeastern Australia is in the grip of one of the worst droughts in our memory. Our mighty agricultural sector is on its knees. In Melbourne, we had a millennium drought where our great forests dried out, and then we had a bushfire that took out 1 million hectares and took 173 lives. If the wind had not changed direction here in Melbourne, thousands of lives would have been lost. In Port Phillip Bay, the Bureau of Meteorology tells us that the tide has, the ocean level has lifted 7 centimetres, and even higher in other parts of Australia, and that is washing away our much valued beaches. So, I mean, if that's not considered an emergency, Rowan, I'm not sure what is. And so we need to step up.
I'll answer that, Nicholas, because very peculiar how water operates, because Fort Denison, the records in Fort Denison in Sydney Harbour, where we have photographic evidence and very substantial records, it was a naval base going back over a century, show that since I think it's 1904, the ocean in Sydney Harbour has dropped 6 centimetres. So maybe that drop went down and it all went up in Port Melbourne. Who knows? Prue MacSween,
I'm
what do you think?
not sure what your authority is there. I'm quoting Bureau of Meteorology tide gauge figures.
Yep.
So this is by our National Scientific Bureau of Meteorology, based on the tide gauge that they have in Port Phillip Bay. And that's been in operation since the 1970s, or actually going back many decades, but it shows a 7 centimetre rise in the tide in Port Phillip Bay since the 1970s.
I got that, Nicholas, I got that. We don't need to repeat ourselves, but as I said, the records in Fort Denison showed the complete opposite. Prue MacSween, you're shaking your head there.
Well, I mean, Nicholas, she was getting himself into such a lather and creating such so much energy, it's making me hot. Nicholas, you and the rest of your cohorts should go to the emergency sections of the hospitals and check how your lobotomy scars are going, because frankly, you haven't got any memory about climate. You know, Australia is the land of, you know, sweeping plains, of you know, drought and flooding, you know, rains. And, I mean, climate changes and has been changing for decades in Australia. There is no emergency. The only emergency is in your heads. You have a drought, particularly the Labor Party and Sarah Hanson-Wrong, have a drought of any policies, and that's the problem. So you're spinning your wheels trying to make something that really is not occurring.
David Gazzard, let's have a quick look at this grab from Keith Pitt earlier today.
I take this motion with a grain of salt, to be honest. If those opposite were serious, they would all be here. Every single one of them would be in the chamber. So this is, at its worst, a stunt, at best, a way to fill some space in this morning's program.
Well, didn't mince his words there. David Gazzard, is this just a stunt from Labor? And more importantly, I did ask Nicholas, but he didn't answer it. Is this a sensible political strategy for Albanese? At the same time his numbers are going down, he's retreating and retreading over policies that lost him the election. Insane, I would have thought.
I think, you know, what you're seeing here is probably, and this is what Keith Pitt was referring to, was the schism that is emerging in Labor about the way it treats its policy agenda and most notably its policies to address climate change. And you have the right of the party that is now looking to back the coalition's less ambitious but still credible targets and hitting its Paris achievements. So the idea that you suddenly turn, it into an emergency is, I think, a good political hook, but I don't think it meets the credible test hook. What is an emergency after all? What does that actually mean? What does that bind you to? You can sell anything if you take on the banner of an emergency. I would note, though, that Mark Butler is desperately trying to keep the caucus in adherence to the policy that he took to the last election, while others in the party aren't as convinced about that and want the party to wind back. So Keith Pitt, I think, is referring to the fracture line that's emerged with climate in the Labor Party.
So, Nicholas, is that correct? And I did ask you before, is this a sensible political strategy? We now have Joel Fitzgibbon, a man I have a lot of time for, which will probably terrify him, but anyway, and he's saying we're not in a climate emergency, we're in a drought emergency. Don't you think, Nicholas, there's a real danger, or do you think climate and drought are the same thing, therefore it's the same emergency? I would say, is there not a danger that people are going to get confused between these two things and Labor end up looking completely clueless about how to solve the drought because they're worrying about the climate?
Well, let me start with agreeing with David Gazzard's point about what's going on in the Labor Party. I think there is a bit of a wrestle going on around policy at the moment, as you would expect after the election outcome back in May. And I'm even going to do you the dignity of agreeing with you, Rowan, and saying that Joel Dean's a good shadow minister and a great servant of the Labor Party. But look, I think people can walk and chew gum on these issues, and I think there is a growing recognition of the fact that climate change is happening now, and it makes shocking events like this terrible drought something that will be more prevalent here in Australia.
Okay, but tell me...
So while we need to take immediate action now to tackle the drought, and I think Anthony Albanese's been putting forward some good ideas on that front. Of course, we also need to be taking immediate action to tackle the long-term challenge, which is containing temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, which the United Nations tells us is the degree we need to keep it to in order to avoid catastrophic harm to our Earth.
Yes, the United Nations don't have much credibility, Nicholas. Every single prediction they've made has been proved wrong. They're the masters of hyperbole, or hyperbole, as your former boss used to call it. So I think we can ignore their ideas. But I want to ask you, Prue...
I mean, certainly they don't rank alongside you, Rowan, in the hyperbole or scientific stakes. But look, I think most people think they're the best authority we've got going round in this matter, with over 2,000 scientists shining up to their targets.
Before we go to Prue, let me just ask you this. What do you think policies, so forget, reducing emissions, do you seriously think that simply by increasing our emissions targets, emissions reduction targets, that's going to magically solve the droughts? Do you really see a connection in your brain?
Well, no, of course not, Rowan. We're in a drought that is affecting us now. We're talking here about targets that Australia needs to achieve out to 2030 and then 2050. So it's a ridiculous question. What we do need to do, though, is take immediate action now to start getting those emissions down. I mean, this is a great challenge for Australia. I think we all agree about that. We need a transition to make, and we need to get cracking on it.
We got
but
that,
Australia's
Nicholas.
up to it, Rowan. Australia's up to it.
Prue, would you? What's your thoughts on the political strategy behind focusing on a climate emergency and somehow confusing it with a drought emergency? And Nicholas seems to think the two are somehow married. Are they married?
Not at all. And I think it's interesting how Albanese is like the kid who wants to be with the cool kids in the schoolyard, wants a seat at the table, wants to get this cabinet going. I mean, seriously, it's a joke. We need to focus on drought. We need to focus on the fact that droughts have happened for years and years, but for governments, consecutive governments have been derelict in their duties of trying to, compensate and irrigate and water Australia. So we have to deal with that short-term vision, but we need a long-term view. But you know, let's not focus on the climate emergency, which is all just, you know, filibuster, I believe. We need to focus on what we are doing in practical terms for the farmers. Morrison has made an inroad, but we need to get feed, we need to get money to them and to these towns as fast as we can, and then we worry about, you know, the long-term irrigating of these areas that are going to be experiencing drought and floods again and again over the years to come.
David, let's just have a listen to Anthony Albanese, I think it was earlier today, talking about this.
These are extraordinary matters in which the government clearly needs assistance. This is put forward in the spirit of bipartisanship. You know, to be fair, when Tony Abbott was the opposition leader, he just said no to everything. That was so. There was no constructive suggestions put forward by the coalition. I intend to be constructive. I think that's what people want.
David, what did you make of that? I found that baffling, those comments. What did you make of them?
Every opposition throughout history has tried to turn itself into a relevant force when it comes to offering advice to the government. So there'd be nothing that Anthony Albanese would like more than to sit at the cabinet table and kind of form a war committee. The one thing I would say is this, is the main thing that farmers need at the moment is rain. The second is that every drought-affected seat in Australia just about is a coalition seat, and I know there's no more acute pressing need on the minds of those members and the Prime Minister than the actual reaction to and response to the drought at the moment. So it has become, you know, an issue that is pressing. It is something that the PM is working on with the leader of the National Party, with the Environment Minister, with the Water Minister, with the Agriculture Minister. They're meeting routinely on it. They've got a task force set up within government that's dealing with it. He's held a drought summit. I would also say, just thinking back, that the first thing he did when he was elected was to head to far north Queensland to visit flood-affected farmers who were seeking assistance because they were cleaning up after a massive flood. The first thing he did when he got back from the US state visit was to go into rural Queensland and from there announce dams. So the government is actually working on this. It is bedeviling them that it's not raining, but they are taking advice from the farm community themselves on how to manage fodder and other things. They're working with the state governments on that because those are both state issues. So I've got no doubt that Anthony Albanese, as a sensible politician, would be seeking to buy his way into the debate from his inner city seat of Grayndler. But I would not be at all surprised if the government says, no thanks, we think we've got this under control.
Well, I hope they do have it under control, but I think Pauline Hanson has had some things to say about the fact that there's too much regulation against building dams. People can't build certain dams on their properties, and that's a whole other story that it needs to be looked at very, very closely. Government regulation that's privatised water, that's for another day. Let's Brexit. So, David, tell me just your thoughts on the latest shenanigans on Brexit, and let's just have a bit of fun where you think it's going to end up.
Rowan, that's a crystal ball I won't even pretend to look into and make a bold prediction. I would say it looks like Boris is inching closer to the numbers that he needs. I do think that the people that are opposed to his solution are really standing in the way of, first of all, the people that voted in the referendum, 3 years ago, but also in denying the Prime Minister what he wants, and that's a chance to clean this up by going to an election. So
very quickly,
whether or not they get the deal...
Yep, sorry, David, we're running out of time. Prue, just very quickly, your thoughts. Where are we going to end up on Brexit?
Well, when you look at a recent poll over there, the people are saying they want to exit. The parliamentarians need to accept that and get on with it and stop acting like buffoons.
Nicholas, what's your thoughts on Brexit? Where's it going to end up in the next week or so?
So, look, I agree with David. I think by hook or by crook, Boris Johnson is getting painfully close now. He's 14 votes short of the majority he needs. He's 20 votes ahead of where Theresa May was able to get things to. There's another vote in the Commons next Tuesday. The whips will be working those numbers like nothing ever seen. You could generate enough power for most of Britain, I suspect, that they'll be working it so hard. So, yeah, let's all eyes will be focused on the Parliament next Tuesday.
Well, Nicholas, I still maintain that this will never be solved until Nigel Farage is either in Downing Street or very close to it. And on that note, I'll leave the three of you. So good to see you.
Thanks, Rob.